All right. Well, um, take a look at this picture here. Um, as you read the bottom, I suppose, of the inscription there, Dinah Morris's certificate of freedom. Dinah Morris's certificate of freedom. Indeed, what we're going to be talking about um, is the freeing of slaves. As you can tell from this picture, you're probably looking at about the late 18th century. You can probably tell that from the tricorner hat, so on and so forth. Likely post-revolution. Anyway, Dinah Morris, and I'm not sure if you can tell, and what appears to be her daughter, um, are about to be issued certificates of freedom. So, you see the term manumission. Manumission, some of you may have never heard of this term before. Here's what manumission is. It is it's not relaxing, but it's the freeing, if you will, um, of slaves. Now, you may have heard of emancipation. Emancipation typically applies to a system-wide, if you will, level of abolition. So, you could apply it to a state, a nation. I guess you could apply it to individuals and so on and so forth. But really, it's supposed to be a system-wide freeing of slaves, whether that be in a given state, whether that be nationwide. That's what it's supposed to be. And oftentimes you hear somebody emancipating their slaves. What you're really hearing is probably the more exact term for that is to manumit. So when we talk about manumission, we're talking about people who are not being forced, at least not by the government. The government isn't forcing them to free their slaves. They're doing this individually and willingly, depending upon their circumstances. A lot of this is happening due to the simple fact that they've relaxed a lot of hard restrictions. That is to say that it used to be hard, if you will, to free your slaves. What was it? Sometimes you had to do it with the courts. Oftentimes, you may well have to do it. You may well have to travel to the seat of government to do it. To give you some idea, as I've been doing some study when I was writing a conference paper on Georgia, given Georgian in Congress, I ran across these laws, right? And it was an act to free, I don't know, Isaiah Johnson, an act to free Fannie McMorris or something like that. That they created individual acts, if you will, in regards to freeing slaves. It may well take an act, if you will, from the legislature. Um, Oftentimes they expected these folks to, um, you know, that they had to have certain meritorious qualities. It's like, well, why are you freeing this person? Is this an outstanding slave? Did he, I don't know, save a mule out of a barn? Putting him on his shoulders or something like that. But basically, you had to go a long way, if you will, to free a slave. And now a lot of those restrictions are being relaxed in this period since the revolution. And obviously, northern states have, a lot of those states are abolishing slavery altogether. So your upper states are leading the way. So remember what your upper states are? Maryland, for example. I guess Kentucky. Um, I guess if you want to include Delaware in that. If you want to count them as a state, Virginia. So the upper South states are leading the way. They are leading the way. Now keep also in mind the tobacco plummet as well as contributing to this. The fact that tobacco isn't as profitable. So that's another reason too. Anyway, now understand that this freedom is in modest numbers. That probably by the time you get, let's see, I don't have anything in front of me right now, but by the time you get, I suppose, maybe one or two decades into the 19th century, you're probably looking at, I don't know, somewhere nearing, maybe exceeding 100,000 slaves, 100,000 blacks being freed. But understand that that number is vastly outshadowed by slaves, of people who were not freed. About 10 to 1, about 9 to 1, I suppose. Well, I don't know, probably about as 10 times as many. Now, the reasons may vary. Think Sunday. Some people have had a more religious change of heart when it came to slavery. And so, as far as they're concerned, their religious interpretation wouldn't allow them to do this. Two, in many cases, people found slavery, simply put, not to be profitable, or not as profitable as they thought it would be. And so they may have gotten rid of slaves in this way. Now, in these cases, understand they also adopted, if you will, if you forgive the language, a pro-choice position on it. That they didn't think that slavery was right for them, but they would not impede upon others' rights, if you will, to have slavery. Let's see. They may shift to different crops. So, whereas tobacco was very labor intensive, you need lots of folks. If you shift to corn or wheat, you wouldn't have to deal with this. That type of thing. So there's varying reasons to do this. Also, keep in mind the way that we go about doing this. Self-purchase. Self-purchase. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of that's pretty clear, right? Well, purchasing yourself. So obviously buying your own freedom, but you may well buy the freedom of your loved ones as well. So that's what we mean by purchase. And generally, that's how, if you will, people obtain their freedom. They obtained it through so-called self-purchase. Now, understand, wait a minute, there's another question you may have. How on earth can a slave possibly, can a slave possibly pay you money? I mean, how is that possible? Okay, well, it is possible through this way. Understand that slaves did have some time. I know, like, states like Georgia said, hey, you could not work a slave on Sunday. It was against the law to do it. So a lot of these slaves had some spare time. Not a lot of spare time, hardly any. But, they were overworked, but they had some time to themselves, and they could, possibly sell things, work, do extra work for someone, so on and so forth. So as a result, they could, accumulate, some money. Now, they will likely use this money to purchase themselves. Now, here is the problem. The problem is you may have just basically exhausted your resources. And so while you've purchased your freedom, in many ways, if you forgive the language, you really can't afford it. Because now you're free, but how do you, sustain yourself? Secondly, I believe you may have had a few cases, and I believe your book brings this up, Of course, we use the African Americans, but if you're using African American Odyssey, that's fine. It's the same dang book. Um, um, but I believe your book brings this up, where there were probably some cases where they gave the master the money, and master just basically just kept the money, if you will, and didn't grant, if you will, the person their freedom. So you had things like that. Um, well, understand, this is still a pretty rough period for blacks. I would say, regardless of what section of the country you live in. Um, what we want to talk about is often, people have often called it scientific racism. Scientific racism. That you had a number of scholars, um, I suppose maybe educated, possibly learned scholars, um, who looked at, science, perhaps sociology, biology, through, if you will, aliens of race. So maybe they'll come up with observations, but they generally were colored by their view of, of what level that they thought blacks and whites existed, and Native Americans. This idea of racial superiority. Um, the revolution called for liberty and equality, I suppose, but that is certainly not what they were looking at. To give you an idea, at least one person had this form of pre-Darwinian, if I'm not mistaken, um, idea of evolution. Here are, here's a chimpanzee, a young chimpanzee. Here's the brain of a young chimpanzee. Well, clearly imperfect, right? Supposedly. Well, then you got, if you will, a black person, as they list here, Negro. And apparently this person isn't quite to where it needs to be just yet. And then you have perfection. And here's perfection right here. So, and it also gives you an idea that that a white man, if you will, is farther away from the chimpanzee as the black man. The idea of scientific racism. The idea that science either confirms, if you will, the racial inferiority of blacks, the idea that people will look at science through a lens of race, so on and so forth. Give me a second here while I fish something out here. Just give me a minute. Thomas Jefferson also has a number of views in regards to race. A number of interesting views. You should be seeing a debate between him and Benjamin Banneker. I believe I assigned that for you, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, in his notes on the state of Virginia, he basically says that blacks are, very much inferior to whites. Let's see. One of them, let's see, what did he say? He said that, for example, in regards to Phyllis Wheatley, a person in regards to the Black Enlightenment, religion indeed has produced a Phyllis well, he misspells her name, Whately, but Phyllis Wheatley. But it could not produce a poet. Well, I mean, my goodness, when we think of poets during this time, probably the first person that comes up, if you will, is Phyllis Wheatley. Um, he talks about blacks, if you will, having a gland in their body that causes, if you will, a terrible odor. You know, just an awful, if you will, odor. You know. Now, of course, what that odor probably is called. You probably could call it working for Thomas Jefferson. That's probably what it is, right? I mean, you know, you're working your behind off for some guy who's working you into the ground, and you know, what do you expect? Okay, let's see here. So they have less hair on the face and body. They they secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. This greater degree of transpiration renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold, if you will, than the whites. What else did I remember seeing here? Oh, yeah, here we go. Here's a good one. Let's see. Then we got to get back to the next page. Hold on. Guess they were talking about. Okay, here. Adding to these flowing hair a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them as uniformly as it is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over his own species. The circumstance of superior beauty is thought worthy in the attention of the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals. Why not in that of man? So in other words, black men crave for white women as they find white women more beautiful as an orangutan, which as far as I can remember is an Asian ape, but anyway, but as an orangutan, if you will, would pine for a black woman. That's what you're dealing with. Clearly, things that would be completely unacceptable to say today. Well, anyway. Now, with this in mind, understand that we also, as a result, get race as a qualification for citizenship. Because since blacks are inferior, he keeps talking about how, you know, they have deficit in thought. They really don't have any real ideas as much as they mimic. They can mimic whites, but they can't really, you know, carry on a civilization. So clearly, blacks are not qualified for citizenship as someone like Thomas Jefferson would probably believe. And indeed, they have race as a qualification for citizenship. You can really see this in the naturalization laws. Now, what is naturalization? Naturalization is what? When you're not a native-born citizen and you go through a process to become one. In this country, it's usually about 5 years, take a test, so on and so forth. All right. Well, they said, if you will, that if you were to come here, as you can tell, the naturalization laws of 1790 and 95, that if you were to come here and you wanted to be a citizen, Your qualification was you had to be white. You had to be white, if you will, to qualify for naturalization. You had to be white. Now, these obviously two laws are during the years of George Washington. You had to be white to become a citizen here. Black isn't going to cut it. You also had the Militia Act of 1792. Matter of fact, there was also a Navy Act as well that basically said if you wanted to serve in the militia, you had to be white, couldn't be black. Now, I understand they broke these laws every now and then, but in regards to the Militia Act, but basically, if they could, they would rather whites fight instead, if you will, of blacks. Now, understand what is going to come out of this, if you will, is a need for free black communities. Well, I'm sorry, they're going to happen. A number of free black communities. Now, understand that since, your numbers aren't that great, probably tens of thousands, a little north of 100,000. It'll get larger than that eventually. But basically, the free blacks compared to slaves, there's far more far more slaves than there are free blacks, but not that great in numbers. If you look at it, probably the fewest were in the lower South. The greatest, that's a good question. Possibly the upper South, but it's hard to say. The upper South and the North were couldn't have been probably within a few tens of thousands of each other. There may well have been more free blacks in the upper South, possibly in the North, but we know for sure that lower South was a distant third. A distant third. You tended to see them on the seaboard. So if you think of some seaboard cities, what would be some seaboard cities? Boston, Philadelphia, New York City, Charleston, although you're probably not going to see too many in Charleston, Wilmington, and a number of other places. If you want to, you could probably even extend the seaboard out to James River, possibly even Richmond or something like that. And they understood that they wouldn't receive the same type of help and treatment from the government, although this is a fairly weak government compared to what we have today. But they weren't going to receive the same type of treatment, if you will, from the whites weren't going to treat them the same as they would free whites. So they had to adapt to separation, this idea of circling the wagons and helping one another. And so that brings us to a very important concept you need to think about, underline it several times, because we're going to talk about it several times, and that is mutual aid and benefit societies. Mutual aid and benefit societies. Basically, a mutual aid society was a society where you had, its members. Its members would collect dues, and these dues were meant to do what? As you think of Northwest Mutual, Liberty Mutual, were to provide for the medical and burial costs of its members. Now, they also, if you will engage in charity. They also will engage, if you will, in not just charity, but they will also, if you will, engage in schools, and we'll talk about a lot of other things. Okay, probably a first one that occurs, I believe it happens in the early 1780s. Once again, this is on the top of my head. I don't have anything in front of me. Would be in Newport, Rhode Island. Probably your most famous one, however, starts out during the Free African Society in Philadelphia. So Free African Society is probably your most famous one. And keep those names in mind there. These names that you see, keep those names firmly in mind. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones will help to found, if you will, the Philadelphia Free African Society in the 1780s. Now, at this time, we also have to keep in mind that they are exclusive to men, these mutual aid societies, that only men can really join them in the beginning. But there are people who are fighting back. Now, one of them, that name should look familiar because we just talked about that last name, didn't we? Sarah Allen. Well, Sarah Allen's clearly the wife of Richard Allen, and she's challenging this notion that only men can join them. Is there anything else we can join, in parallel, something like it? Why just men? Well, add to this the Christian impulse, that this is part and parcel, if you will, of a Christian impulse that is besetting the country. And on top of that, we expect good moral men, if you will, to be part of this so-called mutual aid society. The mutual aid society. Well, another thing we will keep in mind also is this: black churches. Black churches. So as we talk about, if you will, these black churches, understand how these churches worked. Okay, so you see something there called biracial churches, right? All right. Well, here's what a biracial church was. It was a church, you could figure that out, right? At least, blacks and whites were in the church. But we're not talking about integrated churches. Blacks were in one part of the church, and whites were in the other part. If there's a balcony, there's probably blacks in the balcony or something like that. Now understand that the message isn't going to be about Exodus, is it? The last thing that they're going to talk about in this church is slavery. Now, there's quite a few people who may well have been fine, if you will, with blacks being in that church, because they knew what they were being told. The idea is that, hey, if they're in church with us, they're not in church, at least at this moment, with each other, talking about what could very well be dangerous ideas. So we control the messaging. Now understand, I believe there were also some cases where you may have black congregations, but they may have a white hierarchy. Once again, what is the idea? You control the messaging. You're not expecting to hear about how, Moses put it on the people in Exodus, right? You control the messaging. This was very common, I suppose, in the South. Well, as we head to Philadelphia, there was two men, both, if you will, former slaves. I believe they both purchased their freedom. If my memory serves me correct, I think that's how it happened. But they were both, they were former slaves, and one of them being Richard Allen, the other one being Absalom Jones. And one of these men prayed on the white side of the church. And they were like, "Oh, Lord, have mercy." I believe this was this St. George's church? I believe it was St. George's church. And they were like, "Lord, have mercy. I can't believe what you just did." And they said, "Oh, no." And then, next thing you know, the blacks basically left that church. and they were going to form, if you will, um, Mother Bethel Church. Before that happened, Absalom Jones, if you will, was called, if you will, to pastor a St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. Um, just before, if you will, they were about to start up a new church. He and Richard Allen together. Richard Allen goes and establishes, if you will, Mother Bethel United Methodist Church. Mother Bethel United, Mother Bethel, did I say United? I'm sorry, there's no United Methodist Church right now. But Mother Bethel, if you will, Methodist Church in 1793. Well, eventually over time, he changes it from Methodist to a new denomination altogether, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816. In other words, the AME Church in 1816. Well, let us also add to this the blacks in education. How are we going to educate blacks? How are we going to educate the children? And so that was led, if you will, to the idea of white clergy who would, if you will, try to facilitate that. Maybe teach, if you will, black children how to read. Mutual aid and benevolent societies took efforts to try to educate children. Oftentimes the case was, well, where are we going to teach them? Do we have a building in which to teach them? And, some people are like, hey, what I believe Prince Hall, who we're going to be talking about here a little later, said, you know what? I am completely fine with educating these children in my basement. So in my own home. Educating these children by any means necessary. And by about 1818, in Philadelphia, Mother Bethel and Richard Allen strikes again. And they formed the Augustine School. Generally, when they talk about probably the first black school in America, they tend to go to the Augustine School. At least that's usually most noted. Now, understand that there is some resistance to education in the black community. There is some resistance, if you will, to education in, if you will, the black community. So, what is that going to look like for us? A number of blacks would say, hey, why would I send my child to school? Why do you guys go to school, right? You go to school for the reason and for the purpose of one day acquiring the skills to get a job, right? Well, a lot of these parents don't think that they will ever have, these children will be able to become gainfully employed because of the racial climate. So why even try? On top of that, it costs money, so they would probably have to, put in some hard-earned money in order to do this. Now, we also know that this required, or if you will, you'll have, if you will, a number, not a number, but a small, very small number of educated elite. Small number, if you will, of educated elite. So, what I'm going to do is probably just leave it here for now, and then I will cover the rest in another PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm hoping to have some discussion questions to follow this. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye bye.